Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to begin hearing closing statements in relation to Module 6. And the first statement is going to be made on behalf of some of the bereaved survivors and residents by Ms. Barwise, Queen's Counsel. So, Ms. Barwise, if you'd like to come up to what's now the Council's bench. Before I invite Ms. Barwise to start her statement, can I just say this? We have a very tight timetable to get through today, so I'm going to ask all counsel to make sure that they finish their submissions within the time specified in the timetable. I say within because I don't think anyone's going to be grateful to those who overrun or try to overrun, and if necessary, I shall intervene to invite you to draw your statements to a close. With that, Ms. Barwise, we should like to hear from you, please. Thank you very much.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, Mrs. Stefan. Good morning, Mr. Ackball. Our submissions fall into 5 parts. First, an overview. Second, the relationship between building regulations and ADB, the history of fundamental flaws in ADB and amendments made. Third, delays in reviewing ADB following LACNL and knowledge of risk. Fourth, the department's systems failures. And finally, the role of industry. Starting with the overview, the evidence has made plain that the seeds of the Grenfell disaster lie in the concealment, beginning over 20 years ago, of the fact that Class 0 cladding was a fire hazard, at a time when 1960s blocks were failing and more energy-efficient housing was desperately needed. The realisation of a burgeoning cladding crisis led to continued lack of candour, and the failure to adequately regulate the requirements for the external wall was motivated by a desire to allow the construction industry sufficient latitude to rapidly build housing. All this militated against exposing the dangers of existing overcladding upgrades. Over time, this was exacerbated by an overarching, unyielding, safety-blind deregulatory agenda, which ministers deny, but officials believed allowed no change to or clarification of building regulations or ADB. The evidence has revealed an extraordinary conflict, which the panel must resolve, in that ministers would have the panel believe officials laboured of their own volition under this fatal misapprehension. But that is not credible, and the evidence suggests otherwise. The other allied fantasy is that which the panel must resolve is the portrayal of the department's Mr. Martin as a lone wolf. The single point of failure, as Dame Dawes described him, and he, after 7 days of evidence, accepted. Given his physical proximity to colleagues and the way the department operated, this is not credible. The truth of the matter is that he was put and kept in that position to execute the department's deregulatory strategy and indeed promoted even after Grenfell. Colleagues, despite their loyalty to him in giving evidence, must have been aware of his cavalier attitudes, which are evident in the majority of his emails. His fundamental desire to protect the financial interests of UK PLC, as he called it, secured his primacy in the Building Regulations Division. The department completely ignored all the coroner's recommendations following the fatal LACNL House fire in 2009. The review of ADB was deliberately deferred until 2016, 2017, when it would have been done anyway, and was then rolled up into a wider building regulations review. The panel has heard from Mr. Leadsom that the roll-up of ADB into a wider review was so that savings could be made from ADB in order to introduce the necessary environmental changes into approved document L. And that was clear from the documents put to Lord Pickles, who did not deny the intent but thought the figures merely projections. The horse trade between parts B and L was, as both ministers and officials knew, to satisfy deregulatory policies which required the introduction of any new regulation to be compensated for by the omission of existing regulation so as to result in a net equivalent cost to business. These decisions were taken to subjugate building regulation to both the energy efficient and housing and deregulatory agendas at the behest of Prime Ministers, initially David Cameron and latterly Theresa May. The series of warnings concerning modern materials received by the department, often directly to ministers, either by submissions or APPG or the fire sector, in advance of ministers making deregulatory decisions on building regulations, makes undeniable that government knew both regulations and ADB were potentially hazardous, and yet forged on with its twin deregulatory and housing and deregulatory agendas. An accompanying pattern of concealment emerges from BRE's misleading investigations into fires, from the department's failure to transparently report on them, from allowing ambiguity in 12.7 ADB from 1992 onwards, and failing to review ADB at all from 2006, other than for deregulatory purposes, until well after Grenfell. Indeed, the department made a conscious decision, as Dame Dawes told us, not to clarify clause 12.7 ADB even after Grenfell. All this, despite the 2009 Lacanal fire and inquest, goes beyond peradventure. From at latest spring 2015 onwards, when BRE's 7 workstream reports formally reported, the department was aware of ADB's antiquity and of it not having kept pace with modern materials, as made clear by those reports. They were withheld following input from the then Secretary of State, Sajid Javid's advisor. The building regulations discussion document stalled in Lord Heseltine's office. It is clear both the workstream reports and the discussion document were withheld for political reasons. The discussion document was withheld until February 2019, despite the department's appreciation of its significance, because it would have committed the department to a review of building regulations, albeit the scope of the discussion document was purely deregulatory. The workstream reports were withheld because they exposed the extent to which ADB was undermined by the use of modern insulation and showed the need for a complete overhaul of building regulations. The deliberate decision-making is only consistent with a desire to suppress known risks to avoid interfering with the 2 driving imperatives, energy-efficient housing and deregulation. The panel has heard credible evidence from officials that the deregulatory and housing agendas took precedence over building regulations and ADB review, and Lord Barwell also made clear that the housing agenda was predominant. Generally, however, ministers did not admit that the housing and deregulatory agendas took precedence over ADB review despite the life safety risks. In the case of each deferral of ADB post-Lacanal, the relevant minister was aware of the dangers posed by delaying ADB. The evidence has also exposed the tension between functional building requirements, building regulations which implicitly require state scrutiny, and ADB, which is prescriptive, exploited by industry and policed by an inadequate building control, in turn too lightly scrutinised by government. This was exacerbated by introducing approved inspectors who did not compete on a level playing field with local authorities, as they lacked powers of enforcement and would lose fees if work had to revert to local authorities for enforcement. Those authorities had to be cost neutral and therefore were desperate for work. The department considered approved inspectors a regulator, but they are not a public body, have private competing interests, and no enforcement powers. As such, they were merely an inspectorate. But this inequality was overlooked. NHBC's behaviour demonstrates its total unsuitability as a putative regulator. Its acceptance of non-compliant K15 drove it to interpret the regulations and ADB perversely, and latterly in 2016 to publish guidance which approved the use of ACMPE, together with the combustible insulation, without test. NHBC's closing observes that, as insurer of its own book, it is in its own interest not to lower standards. We agree, but probably to save face, that is nevertheless what it did, although NHBC denies this. Underlying ADB was a testing and certification regime propped up by BRE as test house and BBA and LABC as certifiers, with UCAS presiding above. The dishonest and unrepresentative testing and certification was client-focused and carried out by insufficiently competent staff. UCAS's failure to witness BRE testing for some 7 years between 2008 and 2016 shows a disregard only consistent with not wishing to find problems. UCAS emerges as an ineffectual organisation, too willing to assume competence in the bodies it oversaw and so focused on pleasing them at the expense of public safety that it will not even report fraud. The frailty of this house of cards was an ideal prop to facilitate industry capture of an inadequately robust regulatory regime. The role of BRE as advisor on ADB revisions and investigator of fires make it complicit in government's actions. BRE protests that it is not a regulator. We have never said it is, but its code of conduct requires it to hold paramount the health and safety of others. In this fundamental purpose, it failed. Whilst BRE was somewhat hamstrung by the department in the way that it was funded and latterly required not to make recommendations, it is up to a competent service provider, especially a safety-critical service provider, to inform its employer of any constraints affecting its ability to carry out its work. If the supplier doesn't advertise the difficulty, then it is complicit, as BRE was. This is exemplified by BRE's misleading and therefore dangerous research. It does not avail BRE to assert, as it does, that government received warnings from others. Many of these others might have been, and were, perceived as having their own agendas, whereas BRE was supposedly independent. BRE's flaccid recommendations to the department were unscientific and did not communicate the sense of urgency or importance of the recommendation. This was particularly true of the CC 1924 test report, which recommended only that the fact that a Class 0 panel was by far the worst performing of those tested may require further consideration. Whilst BRE was independent from 1997, the relationship between it and the department, with Martin in both camps for 9 years, was unhealthily close. BRE did the department's bidding. An important feature of the department's failure to clarify ADB is BRE's protectionism of its own role as custodian of the fire safety mantle, with a BS 8414 testing monopoly, which blossomed whilst clarification of ADB was being mooted by industry. Whilst, of course, in Module 6, it is right to focus on government and related institutions' responsibility, if industry's role in the events which led to Grenfell is ultimately more important, as I will explain. What follows must be understood in that light. I now turn to the relationship between building regulations and ADB. Building regulations are performance-based, requiring the designer to achieve the functional requirements, and ADB is supposed to postulate routes by which the functional requirements may be achieved. Both the building regulations themselves and ADB make clear that following ADB is not a guarantee of compliance, and therefore the designer must use judgment. There are two relevant respects to Grenfell in which the department failed to adequately address the functional requirements: B41, external fire spread, and B1, means of escape. First, external fire spread. As explained, even if using the linear route, and particularly if using the test route, the designer must exercise judgment. Nevertheless, a culture of convenient dependency on ADB has developed, whereby industry has fixated on diagram 40, which in the versions of ADB in force from 1992 onwards provided a cladding panel need only achieve Class 0 or from 2002 onwards Class B or 0, regardless of its core. This permits ACM panels, even though that is clearly in conflict with the functional requirement. The evidence shows that neither government nor BRE considered how the functional requirement B41 was to be achieved effectively. despite prescribing routes which it now accepts it did not understand and did not know whether they would achieve the functional requirement. The test route depends on not failing the performance requirements in the performance criteria in BR 135, which govern the large-scale BS 8414 tests. The panel has heard evidence from Drs. Colwell and Smith that these criteria are completely arbitrary and are only failure criteria, so they tell the designer only what he should not use, and do not assist with how to design a safe system. As to the linear route, no one considered whether limited combustibility insulation and Class 0 would achieve adequate resistance to flame spread in any type of building, still less a high-rise building. These failures are the primary failures insofar as functional requirement B41 is concerned: delay in withdrawing Class 0 and in failure to introduce the Euro classifications in a timely manner are subsidiary to this failure, albeit significant contributors to the problems experienced. Professor Torero considers the ambiguity resulting from the functional requirements coupled with ADB places a considerable burden on the designer, but Professors Torero and Bisbee, Mr. Hyatt and Mr. Sacula also consider that a competent designer should have understood what the regulations and ADB required. Second, functional requirement B1, means of escape. The department failed to produce adequate guidance in relation to means of escape for those with disabilities. ADB was premised on inclusive design, albeit referencing a repealed statute, and according to Dr. Lane, a competent fire engineer should have appreciated additional measures would be required. However, the department had known since 2004 that means of escape for disabled people, in particular the need to evacuate, were inadequate, especially given the defend-in-place strategy underlying ADB. This was why they commissioned BRE Workstream Report 7. Yet despite that report confirming the guidance was wholly inadequate, nothing was done. Martin admitted he was aware from his involvement in drafting BS 9991 that a better approach was to cater for the scenario where stay put is withdrawn and evacuation required, which Martin thought flowed from Lacanal. Yet there was no formal consideration, even after Lacanal, of ensuring ADB or the LGA guide which supported the regulatory reform fire safety order was consistent with BS 9991. The interface was not addressed because Martin and Brack considered ADB consistent with BS 9991, which they considered simply added more detail. Martin's view and government policy on PEEPs was that disabled people would self-evacuate, or hopefully the fire brigade would get to them in time, and that PEEPs were impractical and too expensive. Martin and Upton were not willing to revisit that, despite Elspeth Grant, a disability consultant's letter, pointing out that the guide breached law. No equality analysis was prepared because they regarded the LGA guide as reflecting current practice, even though it did not. Neither did the department seek advice, and no effort was made to consult. This inaction was not accidental, but was done deliberately to avoid disproportionate burdens on landlords. Martin subsequently contradicted himself, saying government simply forgot to consult with vulnerable people's groups. His take was characteristically offhand. Pursuing the issue is futile. It's a debate that's been going on for years, he said. He admitted to being fed up with Miss Grant's persistence. By 2013, Martin was aware BRE and the stakeholder group on Workstream Report 7 were relying on the concept of extraordinary effort, whereby disabled people would overexert themselves in emergencies. Martin also knew compliance with the Equality Act was considered doubtful. Yet he did nothing to correct these disastrous assumptions or ensure that compliance with the Equality Act was required. The failure to define functional requirement B41 in any adequate way and to provide adequate guidance for B1 means of escape, together with the government's failure to create reliable processes for timely review of ADB and procedures to stay abreast of market developments, created an unsafe system of regulation which pertained from 1992 onwards. Government admits it presided over a system which facilitated disasters such as Grenfell. The primary fault in relation to B41 was the department's failure to address the meaning of the functional requirement and its relationship with the two groups to compliance. Government admits by its closing that it has not been able to unearth any justification for why Class 0 was used as a classification for external walls. That makes all the more extraordinary the now admitted catalogue of 13 missed opportunities to observe that Class 0 was a flawed metric and failure to withdraw it, despite knowledge of the risks. The catalogue of missed opportunities begins earlier than the department admits, with the Knowsley fire. The panel may draw its own conclusions from the department's failure to address the impact of the Knowsley and Garnock fires, or to admit they were also missed opportunities. The necessary context is that overcladding was a means to solve the problem of failing 1960s blocks, and Knowsley was a pilot project. No witness could explain which individuals sent or received the BRE memo recording an instruction from someone in government to play down the Knowsley fire. BRE's failure to identify in subsequent reports that a critical factor in Knowsley was the combustibility of the cladding is an indicator that the subject was taboo. Knowsley was followed by the unexplained removal of the word adequately from both building regulations and ADB for an 8-year period, thereby making the functional requirement to resist external flame spread absolute. Bird and Martin explained the reintroduction of the word adequately was decided by lawyers purely for consistency. But what is the panel to make of that? That the lawyers failed to notice this inconsistency for 8 years? Or is it more likely that removal of adequately was in fact a reaction to the severity of the seminal Knowsley fire, which led to the Connolly system test, which in turn led to the introduction of the large-scale test? The word adequately nevertheless reappeared by amendment to the building regulations in December 1999, despite the Garnock fire in June 1999. Whilst Knowsley is the fire which eventually led to the development of the large-scale test, Garnock should not be dismissed as simply non-compliance, as Martin and some others would have you believe. BRE reported on Garnock in August 1999 to North Ayrshire, making multiple references to Class 0. The deliberate excision from BRE's subsequent report to the department of any trace of Class 0 cannot sensibly be justified by the fact that it was by then known that the cladding was not Class 0. It was highly relevant that the remedial solution proposed in BRE's August 1999 report was to replace what need only have been Class 0 cladding with non-combustible cladding, especially given in August 1999 the word adequately had not yet been reintroduced, so the functional requirement for no flame spread was then absolute. Whilst Professor Bisbee considers Garnock did not in a literal sense demonstrate the need for the large-scale testing because the GRP was not even Class 0 and hence non-compliant, Garnock and Knowsley together led to the Select Committee report. Garnock should have prompted a reconsideration of the linear route. Given the purpose of the large-scale test is to eliminate the worst systems, had it been the sole route to compliance, it would have eliminated Garnock's cladding. Despite Martin and Colwell's continued involvement, and their having witnessed the catastrophic failure of a Class 0 ACM PE in CC 1924 testing in 2001, no one at the department or BRE ever reviewed the Knowsley or Garnock reports in that light. On the contrary, following Lacanal, the department, Martin, actively procured BRE, Crowder, to produce bogus research which led to 2 articles which did not identify the cladding as a significant cause of fire spread at Knowsley and Garnock, did not mention Lacanal, and continued the misconception that Class 0 cladding would limit the rate of fire spread. This is disingenuous and misleading. Crowder accepts the research is flawed, and Professor Bisbee considers it profoundly inaccurate and unhelpful. Even if one of the original authors of the Garnett report, Penny Morgan, confused Class 0 with limited combustibility, those who followed her at BRE suggest there was little confusion. Colwell claims she never understood a colleague to have been confused about this. Crowder claims he may have been a little confused in his early career prior to Lakanal, but not afterwards. These reports should have been the subject of proper analysis by those subsequent BRE commentators who were not confused. It is, however, a convenient confusion to explain dangerously misleading reports. Professor Bisbee expresses amazement that no one realised the cladding or continuous cavity at Knowsley was to blame for fire spread and instead focused on lack of cavity barriers. That amazement reflects the perversity of selecting an obviously wrong cause of fire spread, but it was, however, a necessary dissembling if one wished to detract from cladding being the cause. This happened again at Lakanal, when the government's chief fire and rescue advisor focused on compartmentation as the cause at the expense of downward fire spread, which he now regrets. The department's admitted 13 missed opportunities to withdraw Class 0 began with Connolly's work in 1994. The second is the Select Committee's recommendations in 1999, the third Radar 2, and the fourth the catastrophic ACMP failure in 2001. The remaining admitted missed opportunities to withdraw Class 0, which we do not consider to be a comprehensive list, spans the period 2008 to 2016 and includes Lakanal. The department's explanation why these 13 opportunities were missed is wholly unsatisfactory. Apart from quoting Lord Barwell, who accepted that ministers must bear some responsibility for the failures of the department, officials are blamed for the failure to understand their oversight function and their perception that they could not challenge deregulatory policies. We're therefore back to the position in which we started at Module 6, namely the fallacy that officials had misinterpreted ministers' and Prime Minister's deregulatory agendas, including David Cameron's bonfire of the building regulations effected through the red tape challenge. Whilst the department admits to having other priorities, it does not admit that it was adherence to those priorities which meant ADB was relegated to the back of the queue and that realistically officials had no power to raise its profile. Instead, it blames Mr. Harrell and the building regulations team for becoming totally internalised in their thinking and therefore lacking the will to ensure their work was prioritised. That is blaming individuals for failure to resist an overpowering agenda fanatically adopted by ministers. It runs counter to the department's tangible frustration and Harrell's evidence that his 2017 exchange with Martin suggesting gilding lilies meant finding ways to make the discussion document more attractive to the rest of government and ministers. The department claims its failure to abandon Class 0 after the Select Committee reports was not politically motivated, yet Martin's evidence was it was a deliberate decision to retain Class 0, taken with understanding of the risks which had been clear since Knowsley in 1991. In the circumstances, it can only have been a political decision. Similarly, as the department admits, the failure to remove Class 0 after the radar research, despite the clear warnings that programme gave as to the lack of equivalence between national and European classes, was a conscious decision not to distort the market or be a barrier to trade. That decision was one which was patently against the interests of safety and ought to have been recognised as such. It would not have been a barrier to trade to refuse to allow use of the national classes for a reference scenario which they had not been designed, namely externally as opposed to internally within a compartment. During the 2005-2006 consultation on ADB, the department received a clear warning from Martin, Colwell and Greenwood, all then at BRE, but Martin seconded to the department, that the provisions of Section 12 ADB governing external fire spread were insufficiently clear. The warning flowed from a serious cladding fire at the Edge in 2005 and led Martin to propose a redraft of Section 12, which required all materials in the external wall to be limited combustibility. Martin's evidence was that the department would not make this amendment, as it would prohibit timber frame over 18 metres. The resulting changed version was a hastily contrived fudge. By the insertion of the word filler into 12.7, the department deliberately left ADB 2006 ambiguous. The word filler had been mentioned in BRE's report on the Edge, but latterly mentioned in an NHBC consultation response on insulation provisions. The effect of inserting the word filler into a clause dealing with insulation in practice led to the confusion that whatever filler meant, it did not mean the core of a cladding panel. Both Bird and Martin initially said their thinking was focused on insulation as they were addressing the Edge, which involved insulating core panels. But their evidence evolved such that both later said the word was intended to prompt the designer to think more broadly about the use of a combustible core. It is now clear that the department had not itself thought through the implications of the word filler, nor the products to which it applied. The department adopted this approach in order to allow the use of timber frame and other combustibles in the external wall, because without timber frame, the demand for factory-built, ready-to-assemble housing, which many volume house builders use, could not be satisfied. As Mr. Bird said, requiring all materials in the external wall to be of limited combustibility was too blunt an instrument and had the massive knock-on effect of prohibiting timber frame housing, which Dawes described as kit housing and one of government's top 10 to 15 priorities. At latest, from 2013 onwards, Martin, and likely others in the building regulations team, as well as BRE, were aware of the debate within industry as to the meaning of the external wall guidance. In 2014, an industry body, BCA, produced a guidance note, TGN 18, which did what the department had not and suggested 12.7 required all key components to be limited combustibility. TGN 18 was a mixed blessing. It tightened the linear route, but suggested a specific concept of desktops for BS 8414 tests not contained in ADB and not previously common practice. As NHBC observes in its closing, desktops were common for fire doors, but at least in those tests, the entire door set is tested, not only part of it. Indeed, BRE's Tony Baker in 2013 said BRE would generally not carry out a BS 8414 desktop unless the system was very similar to that tested. Whilst Professor Bisbee accepts desktops were permitted by the building regulations, as the designer may adopt any approach, Bisbee does not consider desktops were expressly specified by ADB as a route to compliance, nor were they. Although ADB's introduction mentioned the possibility of a holistic fire engineering assessment, this was for complex projects such as airport terminals and was not a suggestion of desktops specifically for facades. The whole purpose of ADB was to provide specific routes to comply with the functional requirements. The notion of desktops for BS 8414 tests seems to have created the confusion that BS 8414 equated to a model test, suggesting generic fitness for use. On one view, desktops contradicted the express terms of BR 135, which governs BS 8414, and stipulated the classification report is confined to the precise system tested. Furthermore, it's a test designed to eliminate the worst offenders, and so offers limited data from which a positive assessment can be made. Desktops opened the door to products prohibited by the linear route. Following TGN 18, desktops became the preferred route to compliance, such that BRE was overwhelmed with the number of requests. TGN 18 was therefore causative of industry behaviour. The impact of TGN 18 was exacerbated by the June 2015 edition, which expanded the category of those who might make the assessment to any suitably qualified fire specialist, which was an offensively broad definition and in real terms meant anyone claiming to be a fire specialist could carry out desktops, even if devoid of relevant qualifications. Industry continued to issue warnings as to the lack of clarity regarding the external wall from 2013 onwards, and in 2016 revealed the legacy of ACMPE as a ticking time bomb. Yet these, coupled with a spate of international cladding fires, did not provoke clarification of ADB. As the department admits and was clear from Martin's evidence, from at latest 2014, he appreciated ACM posed a threat, yet given the rules permitted it, yet claimed to have underestimated the scale of the hazard. The department, nevertheless, took no position on it, nor did it change ADB to prohibit ACMPE. I now turn to delays in reviewing ADB post-Lacanal and knowledge of risk being ignored due to the overarching housing and deregulatory agendas. The department's closing fails to analyse extensive evidence put to Ministers Stephen Williams and Lords Wharton and Barwell of their own individual knowledge of safety risks involved in deferring ADB review. APPG repeatedly warned Williams the time frame for ADB review was too slow, and posed a life safety risk. But he simply towed the party line, petulant at being slagged off, as he said, by APPG on account of his dismissive responses to their justifiable concerns. Despite claiming to be aware of such issues, he considered himself unable to flick the dial on them, and as he said, was more focused on zero-carbon homes. He admitted that during the Sophie Rosser debate in spring 2015, which addressed the fire safety issues such as doors, he said the building regulations review was on track, not because he believed it, but because officials told him to. Williams' motivation may derive from the many conversations he admitted to having with Oliver Letwin, then Cabinet Minister for Government Policy, whom Lord Barwell and Dame Dawes described as the minister pushing the deregulatory agenda and leading on the red tape challenge, which Dawes considered a very important part of the drumbeat of the coalition government. Following the department's receipt of BRE's 7 work streams, Harrell asked Martin for a worry list. Harrell claimed the purpose was just to have a cohesive list of things people had expressed concerns about. The language in itself is telling. Despite describing the 7 workstream reports as overall low risk in a 2016 email, Harrell knew that the 7 workstream reports did give cause for worry, hence his telling the panel that they were desperate to release them. As he understood, the first report warned of increased temperatures in fire caused by partel insulation requirements, and the 7th was entirely damning, as he said, of the guidance on means of escape for disabled people. The worry list was followed by the May 2015 War Book produced for Wharton to brief him on concerns. A forwards look produced at his request in late May 2015 introduced the concept of the discussion document, specifically to address the commitments to the Lacanal coroner. As the panel heard, by summer 2015, review of ADB was rolled into a wider review of building regulations. Pausing here, an orderly review of either ADB or the building regulations would have required the publication of the 7 workstream reports and thereafter a discussion document directed by those reports as opposed to directed by the deregulatory agenda, as was the eventual draft discussion document. The reports showed the premise of ADB was undermined by increased temperatures due to insulation, and Report 6 expressly highlighted that it didn't include the effect of fire spread on the external wall. As from May 2015, Lord Wharton was on notice by the War Book of ongoing concerns about the impact of modern materials, particularly combustible foam insulation and wood-based products. The decision to roll ADB into a wider review so that the department could maximise deregulation was a conscious decision taken by the department at the highest level, not only at Director General and Director level, as Dame Dawes claimed, but also by Lord Wharton, who was aware of the extent of delay caused by the deferral. This despite being warned of the risks and urgency of ADB review by APPG's letter received the following day. They told Wharton the failure to review ADB had significant life safety implications. Yet Wharton met with Housing Director Peter Schofield and Director for Building Regulations Sally Randall to discuss the submission on October 2015, following a further patently deregulatory submission copied to the then Secretary of State Greg Clark, which made clear the extent of delay to the discussion document and building regulations review. Wharton approved it. His evidence was he believed earlier review of ADB alone suboptimal. That he understood the purpose of roll-up was deregulatory is clear from his telling APPG that the review's principal objective was simplification and red tape reduction. Lord Wharton became aware, if he was not already, of the catastrophic old tannery fire which happened on the 4th of July 2015 and about which he was interviewed a year later. The note of interview recorded, "We had a lucky escape with the tannery last summer, and the Minister fully understood this." The failure at Old Tannery was extensive failure to install cavity barriers at the outset, as was the Kennet Drive fire in June 2014, which led to the timber frame housing debate in December 2014, and of which both Brandon Lewis and Stephen Williams were also aware. Both fires caused total destruction of many homes, but miraculously without loss of life. The significance of the timber frame and cavity barrier issue is not that it was causative at Grenfell, but rather it demonstrates government's continued disregard for fire safety in housing in circumstances where Martin said he knew that from 2014 a major fire might occur due to lack of cavity barriers. Despite this, nothing was done to ensure compliance or to reconsider the use of timber in facades. During Lord Barwell's time as Housing Minister, the limited process of review, which was underway, ground to a halt. His time in office began in July 2016 and lasted till shortly before the Grenfell fire. Lord Barwell, unlike his predecessor, had responsibility both for housing and building regulations, and on his watch, both the publication of the 7 workstream reports and the discussion document stalled. The discussion document would always have required write round to all departments and the Cabinet Office, but as Barwell told the panel, it was unnecessarily deferred pending publication of the Housing White Paper. The office of the then Secretary of State, Sajid Javid, proposed to Lord Barwell in September 2016 that Javid's dedicated housing policy, Tim Loynig, with whom Barwell worked closely, should review the discussion document as agent for Javid and shape the review. As Leadsom told the panel, Loynig is the person who could have told Javid he could give the green light to the discussion document. As a result of senior officials' subterfuge in November 2016, forcing 2 ministers to communicate with each other in a desperate attempt to make progress on ADB, Lord Barwell received a significant warning. It put him on notice of the long-standing commitment to review ADB and warned him of the need not to become complacent, and that the fire sector was concerned about matters including vulnerable people and changes in construction technology, in particular use of increased combustible materials. He did not ask officials what those were, claims to have probably assumed the materials were timber and considered it to be addressed in the review or the discussion document. He accepted, however, that the only review in progress was the purely deregulatory discussion document. In April 2017, Lord Barwell approved the discussion document and gave his steer to his private secretary that parts B and M were the 2 areas where I feel politically there is a significant pressure to move rapidly. But Leadsom told the panel that Barwell's email to Loynig in April 2017 suggested Barwell again wanted Loynig's buy-in on the discussion document. It read, Gavin was content with the recommendations, particularly interested in the work on parts B and M. Any thoughts, Tim? Loynig evidently had some negative thoughts on the discussion document because Harrell never received Barwell's approval of it and Leadsom never even saw this email thread prior to giving evidence. Barwell was at a loss to explain, but explained his office and Javid's office had caused 5 months' delay to the discussion document as a result of taking a collective decision to prioritise the white paper. The decision to withhold the 7 workstream reports was at the highest level. Contrary to Harrell's evidence that they were politically low risk, Lord Heseltine's private secretary in May 2016 advised Lord Wharton that there are some potential issues here. I will come and speak to you both. In context, these can only have been political issues. Lord Barwell characterised the delay in publishing the reports until February 2019 as absurd, and yet latterly the reports got stuck in his office in 2017, albeit some of that time was with Javid's special advisors or SPADs. SPADs are not technically minded, they advise purely on policy. The only conclusion that can therefore sensibly be drawn from this evidence, taken together with the government's post-Grenfell misinformation campaign that ADB prohibits a PE core, a point it continues to argue, is that government was deliberately withholding the reports. To disclose them would have revealed that government had known ADB's flaws since at latest early 2015, and knew overhaul of the building regulations and ADB was necessary. Given the warnings which led to Grenfell, some deliberately ignored, such as the Select Committee and the chorus led by APPG, delay releasing these critical reports is yet further proof the department was enslaved to its deregulatory agenda in disregard of safety. I now turn to the significance of the department's systems failures. The department is keen to present its failures as due to a lack of understanding its oversight role and inability to gather intelligence. The department was supposed to obtain information from industry to ensure policy reflected current technology. This was known as the intelligent client function. Future developments were to be anticipated by a process known as horizon scanning. Both were an abject failure. As the panel heard from Mr. Harrell, the department was a behind-the-curve function and inherently unresponsive. As a result, building regulations did not keep pace with modern materials. The department not only failed to horizon scan, but to notice, still less diffuse, the ticking time bomb on which it stood. That said, department officials were aware of combustible insulation potentially being in hundreds of homes, and although Harrell and Leadsom denied being aware contemporaneously of the filler debate, Martin claims to have discussed this with them in the 4 years preceding the fire. Harrell and Leadsom also considered warning ministers of flammable tower cladding in 2016, but in fact failed to do so. The process failures, significant as they are, and resulting as they did in an unsafe system of regulation which failed to protect life, are really the product of the overarching and unyielding deregulatory agenda, coupled with the extreme financial constraints following the 2008 crash, which, as Harrell said, halted the regular review of building regulations. It is therefore fundamentally misleading to characterise the parlour state of the building regulations and associated guidance as an unfortunate byproduct of a prolonged lapse in concentration by the department's officials, tinged with some unspecified ministerial responsibility and a degree of austerity. It is more than that. The evidence points to willful blindness and complacency towards safety, which was subjugated to the more pressing and politically appealing housing and deregulatory agendas. That this is so is evidenced by the department's knowledge of risks to life, coupled with deliberate concealment dating back to the instruction to play down the Knowsley fire, which concealment continued through Garnock, through the catastrophic 1924 tests, which were never published and not disclosed to the inquiry until leaked to the press. Latterly, the way in which the department approached the Lacanal inquest and its failure to implement the coroner's recommendations makes clear its disregard for safety in the face of proven risks. Finally, I turn to the role played by industry. It is ultimately responsible for the events which led to the Grenfell disaster. The inquiry's experts consider the external fire spread guidance in ADB, even as it stood, was intelligible to competent designers, and therefore, if Grenfell's designers had been competent, they would have understood it. Those who rely on the ambiguity of filler are not fit to design facades if they fail to realise the core should not equate to diesel or lighter fluid, as ACM PE does, and if they fail to appreciate the risks of using combustible materials. The inquiry will, of course, also need to consider the impact of Arconic's testing of its rivet product to obtain a Class B and its use of that test to obtain a BBA certificate extending to both the rivet and cassette product. That, together with Arconic's reliance on a Class 0 classification for the PE-FR product, despite the PE never having achieved a Class 0, led to a highly misleading BBA certificate. Although Arconic's Mr. Schmidt accepted Mr. Wehler knew or suspected the Class B was not honestly achieved, and although it was superseded by a later test for rivet, resulting in a C, which was subsequently downgraded by Arconic to an E, Arconic's closing perversely maintains its continued reliance on Class B was legitimate. Although industry could not be expected to appreciate Arconic's misrepresentations to the BBA, industry's knowledge of the implications of using ACMPE is clear from its characterisation of the situation as a ticking time bomb. It is therefore not certain that if government had clarified the word filler, or even required A2 in external walls over 18 metres, as it now has, the facade at Grenfell would not have supported lethal fire spread. This is because Grenfell's designers did not claim to be confused by the regulations, principally because most were not familiar with them. And neither was RBKC Building Control competent to detect the patent non-compliance in relation to both insulation and cavity barriers, despite the requirement for those two elements being entirely clear. Similarly, in relation to the other critically relevant consideration for the inquiry, namely means of escape for those with disabilities, Dr. Lane considers ADB is premised on inclusive design and did make clear to the reasonably competent engineer that additional measures were required and that legislation protecting those with disabilities must be complied with. Competent designers were aware of BS 9991 and the different approach to evacuation and stay put. To conclude that the failure to clarify or amend ADB led to the lethal fire spread at Grenfell is to overlook the role of the construction sector in deliberate non-compliance, even in areas where ADB left no room for debate, such as insulation and cavity barriers. The relatively small contribution of any insulation, combustible or otherwise, to the Grenfell fire, which Professor Bisbee puts between 2 to 10%, does not detract from the significance of the prevalent culture of non-compliance and lack of competence. Industry's capacity for both good and bad behaviour is nowhere more starkly personified than in Nick Jenkins, on the one hand advocating greater clarity in Section 12.7 ADB in 2016 and drafting guidance accordingly, but following Grenfell, assisting Kingspan in manipulating the outcome of a building safety programme test, the NJ Joggle, as he called it. Furthermore, just after industry recognised the ticking time bomb posed by ACMPE, NHBC produced its irresponsible July 2016 Acceptability of Common Wall Constructions note. Whilst NHBC accepts by its closing this note was deficient, it was worse than that. It permitted the use of the very products used at Grenfell without the need for test or even a desktop. Whilst the note itself was not causative at Grenfell, being published after the completion of the refurbishment, it evidences the degree to which industry sought to manipulate and circumvent the regulation. NHBC has notably not, in its closing, addressed how the volte-face which led to it issuing this report, this note, occurred. It appeared from the Module 2 evidence that Kingspan may have lobbied NHBC for the production of that note. They certainly had lobbied for the widening of the desktop provision of BCA's TGN 18. Kingspan's closing suggests we argued Kingspan was seminally causative of fire spread at Grenfell. We did not, but said, and still say now, that Kingspan created a false impression from 2005 onwards of the suitability of combustible materials at height. It did so by being the first insulation to seemingly pass a BS 8414 test and by misleading marketing, coupled with Kingspan's expressed desire to educate the market in matters of combustibility and its insignificance in terms of individual product performance. In that sense, it was seminally causative of the UK market's willingness to use combustible materials at height. The fact that at Grenfell, neither Kingspan nor Celotex's insulation was causative of the fire spread beyond the 2 to 10% that any insulation would have contributed does not mean these insulations could not be causative in other constructions. Professor Bisbee has been at pains to stress that such insulation, particularly K15, could be significantly causative if used in a different form of construction. To conclude, whilst it is beyond doubt that the department never addressed functional requirement B1 or B4 adequately, with the result that it has allowed an unsafe framework of regulation to exist for over 30 years, those designing facades and fire engineers designing fire safety strategies must be competent. Had they been, they would have understood the functional requirements and taken responsibility for interpreting them correctly. Whilst Arconic's, Kingspan's and Celotex products were potentially dangerous, the designer should have appreciated their unsuitability for use in a high-rise building with a stay-put policy. Whilst, of course, regulation must be sufficiently clear, building regulation alone cannot prevent disasters. The sectors themselves must engender competence. That alone, however, is not sufficient given the competence crisis that we have. As a minimum, the title fire engineer, we say, should be legally protected. Those are my submissions, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're going to take our morning break rather earlier than usual, and we'll take it at this point. After the break, we're going to hear a closing statement for, on behalf of other bereaved survivors and residents by Mr. Stein, Queen's Counsel, and Mr. Mansfield, Queen's Counsel. That we'll do at 11:15, and at the moment, therefore, we shall rise for our morning break. Thank you very much. We're now going to hear a closing statement, partly by Mr. Stein, Queen's Counsel, and partly by Mr. Mansfield, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the other bereaved survivors and residents. Good morning, Mr. Stein.
Good morning, sir.
Ready to hear you as soon as you're ready.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So as you've already outlined, I will be addressing, first of all, matters on behalf of Team 2, insofar as they concern testing and certification. I'll also be dealing with disability issues, and then Mr. Mansfield will then come forward and then take on the question of central government. So we say this: it is a disgrace that the cladding and insulation manufacturers, Arconic, Celotex and Kingspan, knew that their lethally combustible and toxic materials were being sold on to residential buildings, and that they continue thereafter to profit substantially in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. But it is also a national disgrace that the testers, certifiers and government all knew of the dangers of these materials as well. It is a disgrace that despite this knowledge, nothing was done to protect the only people who did not know, the people living in tower blocks, and in particular those living in the Grenfell Tower, up until the night of the 14th of June 2017. Heaped upon this disgrace is the fact that around 650,000 families, children and disabled people, still live in buildings covered in combustible cladding, 5 years and 6 days after the fire at the Grenfell Tower. That's 5 years and 6 days after 72 innocent men, women and children, and one unborn child lost their lives due to crime, compound negligence and neglect across this industry. So this is why we have called within our written submissions for accountability. What we mean is that at the very least, those who knew and had responsibility should be sacked. Dr. Colwell should go from her position at the BRE, and Brian Martin should be removed from any future work that might have a detrimental effect on people's lives. We don't make this call lightly or frivolously. It is made in the light of the evidence that you have heard during this module. Both individuals, through indolence or professional ineptitude, missed clear opportunities to change the system of regulation, which would have prevented the tragedy at the Grenfell Tower. The fact that a building industry-wide ban on Grenfell-style aluminium composite materials with an unmodified polyethylene core is only coming into force this year is yet another disgrace. Multitudes of flats are still covered in this stuff. In November of 2018, the government introduced regulations intended to ban the use of combustible materials on high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres. Only material achieving the two highest reactions to fire classification, Class A2 and A1, could be applied. But notwithstanding the presence of similar fire safety risks to those in other residential buildings, such as hotels, hostels and boarding houses, they were excluded from the scope of the restrictions introduced under the 2018 regulations. It's taken further public outcry and another consultation. The government has finally decided to extend the 2018 regulation restrictions in the 2022 regulations. This means that this year there will be a complete ban on the use of the type of metal composite material used on the Grenfell Tower, those with unmodified polyethylene core, to ensure it does not become part of an external wall or specified attachment of any new building and buildings undergoing building works, irrelevant of height or use. And finally, hotels, hostels and boarding houses will also and finally be brought within the ban scope. The 2002 regulations should come into force on the 1st of December 2022 and apply unless an initial notice, building notice or full plans have been deposited beforehand and work has started or starts within 6 months of that date. But why allow this? The industry has fair warning in the form of the tragedy at the Grenfell Tower. Don't use these materials. They are dangerous and they are going to be banned. Does it make sense to let an unscrupulous company buy up the no doubt ever cheapening stocks of this material to shove on hospitals just in time to limbo under the ban? Can we please stop putting corporate profits over safety to life? The real question posed by the Module 6 evidence is how it was that so many buildings, including the Grenfell Tower, were made dangerous by the combustible cladding placed on them. We suggest that the witnesses called within Module 6 have done their best to try to hoodwink you, the panel. Witnesses have presented their evidence to imply that there were some suggestions of problems with combustible cladding and insulation and little more than that. The truth is much worse. Grenfell Tower was built not long after the Ronan Point disaster, where an entire corner of a tower block fell away due to poor construction. Ronan Point was a 22-storey tower block in Canning Town, Newham, East London, that partly collapsed in May '68, only 2 months after opening. At Ronan Point, 4 people died and 17 were injured. Because of Ronan Point, Grenfell Tower was built to last until the corrupt, incompetent manufacturers and builders and the erosion of the regime of inspection and building regulation fatally undermined its safety. We need, first of all, in the line of documents that we're going to be examining shortly, to weigh up the understanding of the relevant guides from the BRE starting in 1988. The first edition of BR 135, the 88 guide, warned of risk posed by overcladding materials. We will see that by 1988, concerns regarding cladding systems were already well understood. Concerns of Class O were also clear. And I take you first of all, please, to the document BRE 135, 1988. That is BRE 405553_0006. So you should have in front of you, thank you very much, down my screen, 0_0006. Under regulatory aspects, you'll see bottom right-hand corner, control over the external surface of walls of buildings, particularly those of multi-storey flats, to avoid ignition and flame spread which might endanger the lives of residents above by breaking down effective compartmentation, is currently controlled by reference to tests specified in BS 476, Part 6 and 7. However, these tests only provide information on surface fire behaviour. The overall fire performance of a ventilated cladding system or insulated assembly incorporating independently supported weathering finishes and complicated revealed details can only be investigated under actual fire conditions on a full-scale building facade. To identify the design principles on which constructional recommendations might confidently be based demanded research. This would be to determine both the risk of flame spread over, then please to the next page, thank you, over the surface of the building and the risk of progressive spread via a cavity within the cladding system or through a layer of combustible insulant to areas remote from the original fire. Further down on page 7, the document refers to investigation of the problem. You'll see there. Current concern has involved the likely performance in fire of large areas of external wall insulated in these ways when a flame plume emitted from a window on one story impinges on the facade above. In high-rise buildings, it was felt that a life risk might be caused by the penetration of fire or smoke through walls or upper windows resulting from, I read the second of the 2 bullet points, fire spread through continuous cavities or combustible insulants contained between the solid wall and the external finish of the system. What does this mean? From 1988 cladding fires which may destroy reliance upon compartmentation and meant that stay put as an answer to a fire and at least some tower blocks could not be sustained. This means that from 1988, cladding fires were a known risk, a risk that could kill, a killing risk. The test programme is described in the first edition of BR 135 at page _0007, bottom left-hand corner. That is a timber crib that at point A was designed to provide flames typical of a fully developed building fire impinging on the facade. Page _007 shows the results carried out. Figure 3 shows the rig before the test. It is worthwhile noting that in relation to figure 3, we look at, in fact at figure 4 we can see the same. Some consideration was given to windows being included in the test rig. And if we go back to page 0007, bottom right-hand corner, thank you, experimental fires. Typical experimental fires are illustrated involving a system with insulation sandwiched between entering a wall and B, an aluminium-faced cladding system incorporating expanded polystyrene, the extent of the ventilated cavity being limited by fire barriers. And then top of page 0010, please. Thank you. These are the test results, which revealed at the top of the schedule, under the performance column, that the cladding melted, allowing active EPS fire in cavity and dripping from base of cladding, process slowly self-sustaining. Thank you. Just 3 years after the 1988 BRE guidance was shared with industry, a fire tore through a flagship government-funded project at Knowsley Heights. The guidance in 1988 had foretold the fire's behaviour. The panels there, GRP, glass-reinforced polyester, were class 0, and the cavity acted as a chimney, and smaller window frames created gaps filled with combustible materials. This may sound familiar. As a further premonition of Grenfell Tower fire, flame re-entry occurred throughout the build. Mr. Martin was asked in his evidence in relation to the Knowsley Heights fire why small-scale fire tests, including a Class 0 classification, were an inadequate basis for trying to predict and control a fire in the external cladding. His answer: well, he couldn't recall discussing it and asked rhetorically, where does a surface start and finish? Class O remained in place, allowing a clear threat to life safety to go unchecked. The resulting 1991 building regulations called for cavity barriers in an external cladding system, which of course proved ineffectual at Grenfell. And the functional requirement B4, the external walls of the building shall resist the spread of fires over the walls. Now, jumping ahead in the chronology, it was following the next major cladding fire in 1999 at Garnet Court that B4 was diluted to read, the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire. And suddenly, therefore, in one stroke, fire risk became a subjective exercise, although Anthony Bird of the DCLG claimed his insertion made no difference at all, agreeing, as he put it, it was a lawyer's thing. Now, the BRE had been privatised in 1997. The BRE's ability to advise on policy and carry out crucial research was now severely limited by the new client relationship with government, a relationship demonstrative of government's willingness to limit their own knowledge of risk in favour of cost saving. Beyond this, client confidentiality on manufacturers' failed tests protected the results from wider dissemination. In the future, it is essential and in the public interest for data on failed fire performance tests to be made publicly available. We must ensure decisions made on compliance are able to take account of all known facts, not just those that are proffered by manufacturers in pursuit of a route to market instead of a route to safety. Even though privatised, the oversight body that could have stopped the BRE from running wild was ineffective. Despite identifying multiple failings at the BRE, UCAS failed to enforce throughout the decades. Assessment of the BRE generally was lacking, and the BRE were permitted to act in the interests of industry over public safety. They relied on corporate contract terms to protect them from the obvious need to protect life. On the 11th of June 1999, there was the fire at Garnet Court, a 14-storey block of flats in Irving, North Ayrshire, Scotland. It led to the death of a man who used a wheelchair. 5 others were injured. Cladding was a significant factor in the fire spread. The fire spread via the external cladding, reaching the 12th floor within 10 minutes of outbreak, destroying flats on 9 floors. At Westminster, the Environment, Transport and Regional Affairs Select Committee conducted an investigation. I'm going to turn, please, to the FBU's memorandum, which is FBU 50127_006. The FBU's memorandum outlined the risks from cladding, thank you, and concluded starkly. It's under the heading, whether a risk is posed by such cladding. There are a number of risks that may be posed by the use of combustible or badly installed external cladding systems. Having said that, it should be understood that cladding systems themselves are unlikely to be the first item that is ignited. They are far more likely to become involved in fire as a result of a fire in a room that has vented through the room window and which is travelling up the building face. This is a common occurrence and is predicted by the laws of physics, i.e., heat rises, therefore fire travels upwards. The primary risk, therefore, of a cladding system is that of providing a vehicle for assisting uncontrolled fire spread up the outer face of the building, with the strong possibility of the fire re-entering the building at higher levels via windows or other unprotected areas in the face of the building. This in turn poses a threat to the life safety of the residents above the fire floor. A secondary problem of fire spread through external cladding may be caused by the method of fixing the panels to the exterior facade of the building. If lightweight fixing, aluminium or metal alloys, etc., or resin bonded systems are used to attach the panels, there is a risk of the panels becoming detached when exposed to fire and falling from the face of the building, posing the associated missile risk to firefighters and members of the public in the vicinity of the building. Following the Garnet Court fire, and as a result of a request from the subcommittee to review standards, BRE CC 1924 1924 contract was born. This was meant to be a programme of work to review the guidance given in BR 135, the fire performance of thermal insulation for walls of multi-storey buildings. A major part of this involved large-scale experiments in 2001, one of which included ACM-PE as cladding. Dr. Caldwell recalled this experiment's results as shocking after the rig erupted into 20-metre flames. Mr. Martin, however, could only recall it as an interesting outcome, stating of Dr. Caldwell, she described the mechanism by which it reacted with the fire, i.e. the aluminium burned away, exposed to polyethylene, and then the polyethylene began to burn. Mr. Martin put it this way, I think she said that it failed the test. Yet again, this clear risk was not acted on. The ACM-PE had been included as a result of an industry survey on materials in cladding systems. It is a further total disgrace that this obvious screaming risk to life was simply left, hidden from the public eye, until this inquiry's investigation. A final part of the CC 1924 work was the production of the second edition of BR 135, dated 2003, written by Sarah Caldwell and Brian Martin. Take you, please, to the document, which is BRE 405554_0003. Both at that time were working at the BRE. It was written from the perspective of the BRE's FRS, the Fire Research Station, as part of the contract CC 1924, placed, as you can see, by the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. I'm now going to turn you to another image, but before I do so, it would be best if I give an image warning. The image potentially is upsetting, as it may call back memories of the fire. I'll therefore pause just for one moment, people to react if they wish. Therefore, please turn to BRE 00005554_0002. You can see that there can be no doubt that the severity of a cladding fire was understood. As we can see, a test rig completely under fire on the front page. Now turn to page, same document, page _0009, showing the schematic that we're all familiar with. BRE 135, the second edition, shows the mechanism of fire spread. A reminder of dates. We've had 1988, strong warnings, compartmentation, at risk. By the time we get to 2003, there is absolutely no doubt at all from this schematic of the nature of the risk and how it can be demonstrated on paper. And we can see that this diagram shows graphically a cladding system contributing to fire spread. It can result in a risk of multiple simultaneous secondary fires. The left-hand side of the block of flats schematic, just below the floor from second from the top, the left-hand side of the block schematic states, if the external cladding contributes to the flame spread, there is a risk of secondary fire to all levels. Page 10, that's _0010. Under paragraph 2, fire breakout. Following the initiation of a fire inside the building, if no intervention occurs, the fire may develop to flashover and break out from the room of origin through a window opening or doorway. Flames breaking out of a building from a post-flashover fire will typically extend 2 meters. That seems to be the received wisdom going back to 1988. Will typically extend 2 meters above the top of the opening, irrespective of the material used to construct the outer face of the building envelope. We can see there, figure 3. The severity of the danger is then emphasised under paragraph 4, just further down the page, fire re-entry. Window openings or other unpredicted areas within the flame envelope provide a potential route for fire spread back into the building. This creates the potential for fire to bypass any compartment floors that may be present, leading to a secondary fire on the floor above. If secondary fires are allowed to develop without intervention before flashover occurs, then flames may break out again, thus extending the flame envelope and threatening other openings further up the building, irrespective of the materials used on the building envelope. And finally, at paragraph 5, there is a reference to the impact on firefighting. I'll skip the first sentence. However, where the external cladding system is contributing to the fire propagation rate, the potential exists for the fire to affect multiple stories simultaneously, thus making firefighting more difficult. Perhaps a considerable understatement. This means that from 1988 and confirmed in 2003, Dr. Colwell, Brian Martin, the BRE, government and the building industry are all aware that cladding and insulation can provide a route for fire and be a fire risk itself. If cladding and insulation are involved in a fire, this may leap up a building. If cladding and insulation are involved in a fire, compartmentation may well fail. If cladding and insulation are involved in a fire, firefighting will be made more difficult. Despite the clear warnings in the 1988 edition about the risk of re-entry, via window or otherwise, in the 2003 second edition, any attempt to include windows or apertures in test rigs had also now gone, as we can see at same document, second edition, which is BRE 4055554 at 20. So that's _0020, figure A1. So you will recall recently the questioning by Counsel to the Inquiry of Professor Bisbee, insofar as it touched upon the question of windows apertures not being included in the test rig. So 88, there was some attempt to include. By the time we get to 2003, no windows, no attempt to provide apertures within the test rig. The next revision of BR 135 is in 2013, the third edition. I'll take you briefly to BRE 405555 _002. And then moving on, please, to _0013. Thank you. Thank you. We see our familiar schematic. The third edition of BR 135 repeats the same embedded warnings of fire spread up a building and increased difficulty with fire service intervention, as shown in the second edition. It's worthwhile pausing just to remember what's going on now at the Grenfell Tower itself. By 2013, the refurbishment plans at the Grenfell Tower were well underway. As an example, in November of 2012, there was the design team meeting involving the TMO, Studio E, Curtains Consulting, Max Fordham, Appleyards. The discussion point there regarding cladding was colour and ratio of zinc for the facade, and nothing else. Take you back, please, to the BR 135 third edition to _0023. So 0023. In addition to previous warnings noting the dangers of combustible cladding and insulation, with this second edition there is the consideration of third edition. There is consideration of combustible panels at _0023, second paragraph to the bottom right-hand side. And you'll see there that a little further down, thank you very much, combustible panels reference. Combustible panels are typically based on vinyl or glass reinforced plastic, although various new products are being developed in this area, some of which contain insulation materials. These products generally have good surface spread of flame characteristics to prevent rapid fire spread across the surface of the system. But once the panels become involved in the fire, they have the potential to generate falling debris, add to the overall fire load, and provide a route for fire to propagate up the outside of the building. This paragraph dismally confirms that whilst the outside shell of a product may resist fire spread, it can also be dangerously combustible, making clear the threat posed by its use when involved in a fire. This provides no excuse for the unremitting danger to life from these materials being used on buildings. The trend, therefore, from 88 to 2003 to 2013 has made it clear to all and sundry, government, BRE, all of industry, what is the nature of this risk, what is the extent and seriousness of this danger. But of course, we have the evidence that relates to other fires. It's already been mentioned by Ms. Barwise, Queen's Counsel, the fire at the Manchester's The Edge development. That building was clad, this is 2005, in sandwich panels that contributed to rapid fire spread up 17 floors in just 10 minutes. Dr. Colwell's subsequent report on the fire suggested the government revisit the relevant section of approved document B, guidance around external wall construction, to remove confusion about what materials were compliant. Following that work, Mr. Martin rewrote this section as part of a new draft version of approved document B, including a new section stating that insulation or any other material used in external wall construction in a building over 18 metres tall should be of limited combustibility. However, despite this being included in the draft, the final version of approved document B omitted that amendment, instead stating that any insulation product or filler material should be of limited combustibility. That phrasing never went out to consultation, and Mr. Martin admitted the thinking was that they could come back and slip in something unconsulted on later. You've also heard the evidence that relates to the group meeting at the CWCT, the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology, which effectively tasked the BRE Dr. Sarah Colwell in July of 2014 to draft an FAQ. According to the meeting minutes, the dangers of ACM cladding with a polyethylene core were raised, with attendees pointing to major fires in the Middle East and France. Pausing again, 2014, by that stage you've had the Water Club Tower, Atlantic City, you've had Walsh in Golden Sweets fire in South Korea, Mermoz Tower, Roubaix, France, the Safe Belhaza building fire in Tekum, Dubai, and the Tamely Tower, Dubai fire. These are all fires involving exterior panel facades. So at that meeting, Dr. Colwell was directed to the fact of the other fires in other parts of the world. Dr. Colwell apparently tried to explain that approved document B was intended to prohibit ACM use in buildings over 18 metres tall, but was told the current wording was insufficient, as it only referred to prohibiting combustible insulation products, with cladding panels apparently subject to the lower fire classification, Class 0, a standard many ACM products claim to obtain. Dr. Colwell agreed to take responsibility for a clarifying FAQ and raised it with Mr. Martin, the civil servant responsible for the guidance. Mr. Martin, as you will recall, had attended the meeting but left before this discussion. Dr. Colwell never completed the FAQ, later claiming she believed the issue would be dealt with in a forthcoming revision of approved document B. She said, "It was assumed that it would be taken up with that. That is why we didn't pursue that conversation with Brian, which in hindsight is something I should have done. Therefore, approved document B was never revised and remained in place until after the Grenfell Tower fire." Dr. Colwell indicated that by September she had decided not to draft an FAQ, but failed to inform the CWTC group. She said, on reflection, "It is something I should have followed up directly with the group. I fully acknowledge it was a lapse on my part not keeping them fully informed with regard to the whole process." It was also, as you recall, revealed in her evidence that Dr. Colwell failed to reveal those details in her witness statement. The inquiry has heard that she told an attendee at the March 2015 meeting that she had completed a draft of the FAQ. However, when an attendee chased for an update, she ignored multiple emails and voicemails until that individual gave up. It should be remembered that the CWCT 2004 meeting came at a potentially critical moment, when the final decisions to clad Grenfell Tower in highly combustible polyethylene cord panels were being considered. Despite a clear golden thread of knowledge of risk posed by overcladding, industry-produced guidance flew in the face of public safety. The BCA, the Building Control Alliance, Technical Guidance Note 18, legitimised desktop studies, which operated in a space of entirely insufficient knowledge of performance of materials. And Professor Besby, as recently described, the 6 desktop studies he reviewed as missing basic information, pretty inadequate, and not evidence-based. Mr. Martin was aware of incompetent studies in use, but entirely failed to act to warn his own department, even speaking at the launch of the later 2016 note permitting the Grenfell cladding and insulation combination. It is against the background that we have set out of known danger to life that the evidence of all Module 6 witnesses must be judged. It is not just that in the past these witnesses didn't take the risk seriously, but importantly, they didn't take account of the seriousness of the risk. In addition, we urge the inquiry to give careful consideration to the abject performance of organisations such as the NHBC and LABC, who have, through a process of evolution, taken on regulatory functions under the guise of profit-making businesses. From 2009 to 2015, the LABC certified Kingspan's K15 and seller taxes RS 5000 based upon missing, false or misleading data, and NHBC ultimately greenlit the use of ACM RS 5000 and K15 in their 2016 guidance. Now, we all recall the evidence from Professor Bisbee describing what he was describing as the limited contribution to the fire of those materials. But we need to remember at all times the toxicity of those materials and the gases that they gave off. And therefore, the contribution cannot just be limited to how much flame they produced. Both the LABC and NHBC private companies gave false reassurances as to public safety. This was against the background of industry having the clearest of warnings surrounding the use of these products from BR 135 editions 1 to 3. As with the certifiers in Module 2, there is a clear tension between the public service obligation of ensuring public safety and commercial pressures where private businesses conduct regulatory or quasi-regulatory functions. It should not need to be said, but public safety must be the driving and principal concern in any and all circumstances. The evidence you have heard demonstrates that instead of profit-making, the evidence from, I'll start that sentence again. The evidence you have heard demonstrates that instead, profit-making has been given an equal and sometimes overriding emphasis over public safety. As of this moment, the evidence from inquiry experts, Professors Bisbee and Torero, stands to say that much must be done to test cladding systems and materials used within such systems. And much must be done to test such systems before we can get a standard for such construction. What does that mean? Well, it means this, that until the science is settled, our ability to measure the safety of existing exterior cladding systems is also seriously suspect. Our clients say with responsibility comes accountability. Stated by Professor Bisbee on day 291 of the inquiry, if it's your job to write building regulations, then you need to make sure that what you are doing is representative of what is happening in the world. And if you don't, then you're not doing your job. And he's mentioned the fact that this jurisdiction stands on an international stage. Our systems are not just our own, but emulated by other countries. That means that we cannot imagine that our disgrace from a failure to act on the consistent knowledge of risk dating back over 4 decades affects just us. This cannot be allowed to continue. The system must be reformed so that the discharge of regulatory functions concerning public safety is put back into the hands of entities that are protected from and not subject to any competing forces such as the desire to make money. Further attention should be paid to the market dominance of organisations such as the NHBC, which, because of their market share, hold an inordinate amount of power in shaping safety standards. Our submission is that a new safety standard must be set within the building industry, a Grenfell standard. This must be not only what is thought to be safe, but additionally a wide margin on top to account for industry crime, builders and designers' ignorance and incompetence and expert error. The Grenfell standard should mean that in practice that a door that is rated potentially to withstand 30 minutes subject to a fire, judged to be sufficient to allow for the arrival of firefighters. Add 30 minutes to make sure, to make safe. The Grenfell standard could become a mark of safety across the building industry and be a very small part of remembering those who died in the fire. I now turn to disability issues. The bare minimum we should accept is that a block is only safe if it is safe for all residents. Not just for all residents except disabled people. The future litmus test for fire safety should be to regard people with disabilities, those who need the law's protection most, as mentioned by Mr. Thomas, Queen's Counsel, early on in the inquiry, and their ability to survive as the minimum standard by which we should judge risk to life from fire. We have heard shocking evidence about government attitudes toward disabled residents and their safety from fire in the years between Lakanal and Grenfell. But the government has even managed to trump this. On the eve of the 5th anniversary of the fire, 2.5 years after the Prime Minister committed to implementing the recommendations, the government reneged on that commitment by openly rejecting the recommendations most focused on protecting disabled people. What could have led to that mindset? We have seen how little the government wished to do to improve things after the Lakanal coroner's recommendations. For disabled people, it was worse. Post-Lakanal, the government chose to actually make them less safe. According to the DCLG's Louise Upton, Lakanal House was totemic, and for the housing sector, guidance was the thing that was most wanted after the fire. Brian Martin admitted that before 2011, all statutory guidance on means of escape for disabled people recognised that disabled people had a right to a plan for their evacuation in case of a fire. To the government, that was a big problem. Within 2 days of his office being selected to write the LGA guidance, Colin Todd recorded that disabled evacuation had been identified as one of the showstoppers to address, as he put it, evacuation or not. What resulted was the 2011 LGA guide. By 2013, without independent analysis, the official statutory guidance was born and endorsed by Lord Pickles in his response to the Lakanal R43 letter, Rule 43 letter. The LGA guidance stated without precedent that responsible persons need not have any plan for how disabled people would evacuate a building in case of imminent danger. In getting there, the government dismissed concerns that it was discriminating against disabled people contrary to the Equality Act. We suggest this. The government's guidance on landlords' evacuation duties to disabled residents was unsafe and unlawful, ignoring the public sector equality duty. We now know that this arose out of a culture of complete disregard for the views of disabled people. Neither Mr. Todd or the government consulted disabled people, or disability organisations or specialists at all before deciding it was unrealistic to expect landlords to have an evacuation plan for disabled residents. Why didn't they ask disabled people? There were two strands to government-led officials' evidence on fire safety and building regulations. On the one hand, they forgot about disabled people. But the more illuminating and deadly strand was that they didn't think disabled people had anything useful to add to their own safety from fire, and landlords' views would suffice. As a result, the only stakeholders whose views counted were Mr. Todd's office and his clients, landlords, not residents. This is how the government operated. So current practice became best practice. Now, the government had hardly allowed the ink to dry on the transcripts of this evidence before they revealed their stance on this inquiry's PEEPS recommendations. At the Building Safety Bill's third reading in May of this year, Building Safety Minister Lord Stephen Greenwalsh stated, 15 of the 37 disabled residents living in Grenfell Tower died in the fire. That is more than 40% of the disabled residents. The government are committed to supporting the fire safety of disabled and vulnerable residents. In the next breath, his tone changed. The government ran a consultation on the issue of personal emergency evacuation plans, PEEPS, in July 2021. The consultation has made clear the substantial difficulties of mandating PEEPS in high-rise residential buildings around practicality, proportionality and safety. Except it didn't. The PEEPS recommendations were massively backed up by the public consultation, including by disabled people and organisations, 80 to 90% supported PEEPs. That mantra, practicality, proportionality and safety, was not new. We've heard those words before. This is a haunting echo of the government witnesses' evidence to this inquiry about why it attempted to relieve landlords of their vital duties to disabled people. These three obstacles to implementing the 23 recommendations, purportedly revealed by the July 2021 consultation, were in reality taken from the same playbook employed a decade ago and defended in Mr. Martin's evidence. First, Lord Greenough said, on practicality, how can you evacuate a mobility impaired person from a tall building before the professionals from the fire and rescue service arrive? Disabled people and organisations had told the government how PEEPs could work with the assistance of staff or others, the phrase used in the guide itself. But the government regurgitated the same stance Mr. Martin used in his dismissal of the contemptuously named benevolent neighbour. Secondly, Lord Greenough stated, on proportionality, how much is it reasonable to spend to do this at the same time as we are seeking to protect residents and taxpayers from excessive costs? A decade previously, the government dismissed discrimination concerns due to an anxiety to avoid imposing disproportionate burdens on landlords. And Ms. Upton agreed that this should have been disclosed in a spirit of candour. That purported concern for residents and taxpayers resulted from closed-door meetings with landlords. That disabled people should be trapped to die in fire to avoid excessive cost was one of Brian Martin's dark facts. Brian Martin was asked, so people die in their flats because they're bedbound, because it's too expensive to have a system to get them out? His answer, I suppose so. Lord Greenough's third point was on safety. How can you ensure that an evacuation of mobility impaired people is carried out in a way that does not hinder others in evacuating or the fire service in fighting the fire? And Lord Greenough attempts to justify why disabled people would continue to be left in their flats in a high-rise fire because they might slow down non-disabled people exercising their rights to evacuate. It was that mindset that led to 40% dying in the Grenfell Tower. It was the view, went on to say, at the time that hopefully the fire brigade would get to them in time. But if not, that's one of the reasons why there are a large number of people with disabilities that die in fire. It's because they can't get themselves away from an incident. This was the government's decision. Rejection of your inquiry, this inquiry's recommendations on PEEPs and sharing information with the FRS for nearly all high-rise blocks. For the very small fraction of high-rise blocks with simultaneous evacuation policy, their very highest risk, there is a person-centred fire risk assessment, a PCFRA. Typical suggested outcomes include fire retardant bedding and fire-safe ashtrays. Well, they're fine in themselves, I suppose, but they're not an evacuation. It was the minister who said 40% died in Grenfell. This was not because they had a cigarette in bed. What this is instead is a sad reminder of the evidence before this inquiry that apparently disabled people are a risk to themselves and to others. Has time already softened the tragedy's impact? Have the government's failures and their consequences already been forgotten? It's the purpose of this inquiry that this should not happen and that this tragedy should never be repeated. We suggest that the government's rejection of this inquiry's recommendations to safeguard the most vulnerable who are at risk of death strikes at the heart of that purpose. One final point. When I came into this inquiry, I had to make myself familiar with the system of regulation that in theory existed, and I paid close attention to Dame Judith Hackett's reports, which predicted much of the concerns and considerations that you have considered with this inquiry. Heaven knows what Dame Judith would now say after hearing this evidence. She said that the regulatory structure was not fit for purpose. What words would she use now? One thing that we all expected was that there would be a system of some type. A system of checks and balances, risk assessment, impact assessments, the very stuff of regulation. We've seen nothing of that. And on all of the issues that I've been speaking about this morning, including disability issues, if there had been any type of system at all, impact assessment, risk assessment, and the type, consideration by committees, by meetings, by those people that actually are paying attention to these details, then this tragedy may have been avoided. So we're looking ahead now to a system in the future, but it needs to be one that has a system of checks and balances, risk assessment and impact assessment that looks carefully at these matters into the future. My final point, that's never going to be cheap. It has to be paid for and it has to be funded. So those are our submissions. I now turn and cede my place to Mr. Mansfield.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stein. Yes, on Mr. Mansfield, you're going to add to that statement on behalf of your client. So would you like to come up? Yes, Mr. Mansfield, when you're ready.
I will be in a moment, I'm sorry.
There's no rush, don't worry.
Good morning, Chair, Thuria Estefan and Ali Akbar as well this morning. You've had, well, in a sense the public will realise because it's publicly available, from the families, that's split into Team 1 and 2, you've had extensive, detailed, written submissions on this part of, well, the whole of Module 6, but the part I'm dealing with is included in that. Now, in addition, you've had detailed submissions this morning, so I hope that it might be acceptable if I were to, and would be of assistance to you, if I were to, well, in my case, I'm sitting back, but stand back a little and try and sort of distill some principles for the future out of this module. Because as you listen, perhaps the most startling fact is that the simple solution that might have obviated the need for any of us to be here was present for many years, was neglected by successive governments, but obviously particularly one I shall come to in a moment, between 2010 and 15, namely David Cameron's. There was one staring them in the face. This can't be explained by the fact that they didn't know, because they did know. It can't be explained by oversight, forgetting, falling between the gaps. It's much more serious than that. And one has to say, as the Select Committee did, the Fire Service did before that, just how many deaths do there have to be before changes are made? A refrain that you will have come across many times. It's not limited, interestingly, to building regulations or other forms of social interplay. It's a kind of lethargy which says, well, and in fact Martin said this at one point, it is as I think he wasn't so keen to adopt the strength of the words, but it's this let the bodies build up. Where are the bodies? Attitude. Before pedestrian crossing, whatever it happens to be, safety issue, is put in place. So it's no accident that this has happened. And of course, the measure that can be focused on very simply and was spelt out in the Select Committee, as you've seen, in 1999. And not entirely it was encompassed, but it was there. The seeds were there and have remained there, namely a ban on combustibles. And it's what the families whom I represent and everybody else who's heard represents. These are the questions. Why did it take so long for this to happen? In fact, it's only really happened about a week ago. Interesting. Just before this part of this module, that finally we get the complete picture. It isn't even complete yet. Why has it taken a decade, essentially a decade, to get to this position? Now, that question, because you will recall that counsel to the inquiry, very helpfully, we put them in our submissions, set out 4 questions for this module. What were the risks from fire, and were they, in high-rise properties, understood by government before the blaze? First question. I'll come back to that. Had lessons been learned from previous incidents in the United Kingdom and overseas? Third question. What steps had or had not been taken by government to address these risks from fire? Final question, perhaps of all the most important, because it links to what I'm saying at the moment about why. Namely, what motivated government in its approach to fires before the 2017 disaster? That, we say, is the key to answering why it took so long. It is, in fact, of course, a motivation that is discernible, and I'll come to exactly, and you've heard it before, but it's worth just going over it a little to indicate the strength of that motivation, because the length of time waiting is excessive and extraordinary and can't be explained by anything other than a determined policy not to do it. In other words, not to have the ban. The second allied question to that, you may think, that is necessary for this inquiry to think about, because of the length, the duration of dilatory behaviour by government, not just the one in 2010. And what has to be remedied for the future, appreciating the inquiry itself may not be able to encompass all of this, but it is essential to think, how did such a motivating force over such a long period survive and to a terrible extent succeed, because it killed 72, there was no ban. I appreciate there are other factors, but the ban is pretty central. And part of the answer to that part of the why question is, of course, the nature of the governance under which we all live. And I want, if I may, just to address that, because it is a situation in which, when a centralised government is motivated in the way successive governments, obviously right up to the last, were motivated, we do not appear to have the means any longer. It is, like Grenfell Tower itself, the fault lines in government are severe. And it's when you begin to address those two questions related to the, I'm calling it the why, but the motivation question as set by counsel, that one begins to say, yes, why did that happen? And could I just bring it up to date, just with things that have happened? We say the legacy is still there. The legacy of the why it happened over 10 years to even get to the stage we're at. Well, so you may remember because you were there when I first opened the case in Phase 1 for the families. And I used a quite astonishing occurrence. And I want to just refer to it again because there's a risk that it's all going to be repeated. And I appreciate that none of you as the panel want to look back and feel that the work that everybody's done and put into this inquiry, resources into this inquiry, are going to be at the behest and whim of whoever happens to be in power at that point. But the example I gave at the beginning was, and now might be perhaps even more potent because of the evidence you've heard, that on the 14th of June, the day of the fire itself, there was a meeting set up. The meeting was convened in the name of the Red Tape Challenge, RTC, which has this, it's like an eminence grise in this case, it hangs behind, set up in April 2011, essentially by David Cameron, but chaired by Oliver Letwin. Now, the terrible irony of this, as it were, motivational factor, the why question, is that on that day, what were they due to discuss? They were due to, so it certainly wasn't off the agenda, as Lord Pickles seemed to think, and I have to come back to him, obviously. They were considering whether it would be possible to liberate a little more cladding onto the market in the absence of European standards to enable industry to, as it were, exercise their rights in the marketplace. Of course, as it is understood, the meeting didn't happen. However, that's a telling example of what is possible here. Now, I raise it because not only does it illustrate what was going on in that period, particularly, but there is a risk that a similar situation could occur again. It may not have come to everybody's notice, but on the 14th of June this year, recently gone with the Memorial Week that there's been, there was a meeting in Parliament of, and it's the first one that has happened apparently, the National Insulation Association held its first parliamentary meeting. There were members of government there and a member of the House of Lords who was a minister as well, all there. In principle, of course, that's part of the process of our government. But what is interesting is not just that this was publicised on the 14th, the actual meeting was just before, a week or so before. It was publicised on the 14th. And what was extraordinary was, and it shows that there is a legacy unless we're careful, there was no mention of Grenfell. One doesn't obviously want to fall overboard, but one is somewhat surprised in the publicity that they gave to this on the 14th, the meeting having a few days before. Not a single mention of Grenfell. A lot of mention of the role of the insulation industry in relation to green energy. That's a perfectly valid point. But however, one might have thought that the lessons of Grenfell had percolated industry to such an extent that on that week before the memorials, they might at least have remembered. They might at least, because you've heard this morning from the previous speakers about the role, and you've heard in evidence as well, the role of insulation in this particular case. What it tends to demonstrate, I don't overreg it, what tends to demonstrate here is that the relationship between those in government, the ministers in particular, industry and safety, is still at risk if it's not respected, if it's not given the place that it's due in our society. The second point has been touched on by Mr. Stein only minutes ago, so I don't go back through it. But what is interesting is in the debate over building safety, fire safety guidance, which is being put out at this moment, it is in fact the terms, he's been through the terms, on which it's, for the moment, been rejected so far as the recommendations for those who are less able, those who are vulnerable. In a way that is, as the word's been used, the litmus test. I mean, the phrase has been coined on many occasions that the measure of a society lies within how it treats those who are most vulnerable. Attributed originally to Mahatma Gandhi, but it may have been others. It's had different phraseology at different times. But the point is a very simple and extremely good one. Namely, you do at the end of the day, whatever else you do or don't do, that's the one. To suggest that it's going to cost too much, it's going to cost too much if you don't, as we now see. It's the wrong economic analysis which should not be applied. But perhaps the worst aspect of what was said in the House of Lords over these measures, sent back for consultation for another, as it were, kick into the long grass, is that in the same way that fire safety became an impediment to government policy in 2010, 11 and 12, we now find that the disabled, those less able, they have become the impediment because they might get in the way of the able-bodied making a quick exit. And one only has to put that in its, as it were, true light to recognise the risks that still pertain in terms of making progress on all of these matters. So before I just distill a couple of principles, I would, if you would forgive me, want to just read, I'm not sure, obviously, I'm not the extent to which you may have already read the written submissions, but there are just a few initial paragraphs in the one we submitted on behalf of Team 2 for government, because it does summarise our position, but it also it leads into the principles I just want to develop in the time we have today. The paragraphs, so that you have them in case you need to refer to them again, come under the heading of central government, and they're the preamble. It's a few paragraphs, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. That's it. But this is how it's phrased, and I just would like to read this part of it. The nature and substance of the evidence in the inquiry in this part of the module beggars belief. Belief in a system that failed to protect the right to life. There is one overarching conclusion that the edifice of government was and remains as much at risk as Grenfell Tower itself was in 2017. The inquiries expose the fundamental fault lines in both, the former significantly contributing to the latter. An unresponsive system of parliamentary democracy wherein the concentration of power is vested in a cabal of short-term ministers bereft of any technical expertise to enable challenge, inquiry, robust oversight and transparency. This was, and is, a recipe for disaster. The core accelerant fanning the flames was a deep-rooted, remorseless, aggressive political dogma disguised as freedom. Freedom to facilitate the interests of industry and private enterprise. This combination of forces nurtured a hostile environment where health and fire safety, human rights and equality within social housing were systematically portrayed as impediments to the free market. This provided license and momentum for behaviours ranging from incompetent to grossly negligent and corrupt. The testimony in the government part of this module, which has singularly marked those in positions of authority and responsibility, is characterised by arrogance, ignorance, indifference, and in some instances, deceit. Witnesses have regularly shown a remarkable lack of awareness. Effectively, the higher you go, the less you know. As if this is a quality to be proud of. It has often been born from not wanting to know, as it didn't fit the political purpose of government. It has become increasingly clear that few, if any, of the Nolan's 7 principles of public life have been upheld by the majority of senior politicians and civil servants. And we list those principles. I do it quickly without the description that follows. These were published in 1995, and it's easy to overlook and brush them aside. But these principles are selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. I pause on that before finishing the last paragraph, because, again, a reflective moment. Is it possible to look back on this module and say that really any of those have been satisfied by the witnesses, particularly the ones in prime position, particularly Brian Martin, particularly Lord Pickles? I'm going to add David Cameron for reasons I'll come to at the end. And the answer, I think, would be no, they have not been upheld. And in fact, worse, seriously undermined. And these weren't contrived, these principles, just for academic discussion. They were contrived because it was necessary to imbue public life with a sense of morality, if nothing else. And in a sense, that's what the families are looking for here. The last paragraph of this preamble reads as follows: the apotheosis of this race to the bottom came in the module's final stages with Lord Pickles. His demeanour, his excuses, ill-informed attempt at empathy right at the end do not bear repetition. Even his apology is couched in terms of an involuntary act of misspeak for which he is not really responsible. Well, we say here you have another fine example of why these principles are extremely important, because one has to re-examine, as part of the inquiry's robust approach to the evidence, is the why question again, why it went on for so long. Because actually at the end of the day, those concepts that are contained in those principles, combined with the concept of ministerial responsibility, where is it? Now, Mr. Millett put very carefully to Lord Pickles, which he accepted in the end responsibility, but it was like, if you will remember, a brush-off. Yes, of course I'm responsible. It doesn't mean anything, because within minutes, of course, were the errors that he was making. So ministerial responsibility in our system at the moment, which is important in terms of not only those principles, but the question of accountability. Now, it's not just me or Mr. Stein or Stephanie Barwise asking these questions. The families, as you attended, the memorials last week, more than one, but particularly the one at the Tower. What is it that the families and those who speak on their behalf are wanting? It's easy, it trips off the tongue. Justice. It can be a meaningless concept, but not in this one. This time it's very meaningful, because justice for those who are truly responsible, and of course I'm already putting fingers very carefully on those who are responsible, they are expecting that those who have and should have, if ministerial responsibility is going to mean anything, then there has to be a follow-up. There has to be justice for the families in terms of the accountability. There's two forms of accountability. There's the one you have here, in which witnesses come and are asked questions perfectly properly. But the families are not, and it isn't, and obviously are not wishing to indicate what the inquiry's function is, as you know well. It's not expected that you will deliver accountability. You will identify where responsibility lies in this particular instance. And that has been done through the evidence. And it is hoped that those who are watching, those who are listening, those who are receiving this evidence will understand that this is only half the exercise, long though it's taken to do, but necessarily do in careful detail. So that process has not yet finished. So accountability, part of the Nolan principles, is absolutely vital if this inquiry at the end of the day, besides making changes in government thinking, and one hopes that the government will rethink their rejection of the less able or vulnerable. So accountability, we say, is key point here. But actually, at the end of the day, it's combined with another proposition, and that is the one that is likely still to be pushed to the back. And that is a respect, not just for those who are less mobile, but a respect generally for public health and safety. And we say that hasn't been present. It's one of the reasons for the gap. The length of time is because the deregulatory agenda, which existed long before, many years before, the advent of the coalition government in 2010. So it had existed for many years before, that deregulatory approach. Safety was not taken seriously. It wasn't on everybody's lips. It wasn't something that was a pressing need. But of course, that's stage one. It's not given the respect it's due. Once it isn't given the respect, and it's something that is an also-ran, something that can be traded off so that industry can get on with its business, and so it becomes obviously later 1 in, 2 out, 3 out, and so on. The honed regulatory agenda, which is the key one here. So it's not regarded with respect, but it gets worse than that. Again, that's the key factor here. Because obviously deregulation goes back through a number of governments. And as I shall be saying at the end, there is a character in this whole scenario that you haven't heard from, but he is, we say, responsible for the deregulation agenda, deregulatory agenda, being honed specifically, not just to disregard fire safety and safety, but actually to ditch it, actually to target it, actually to kill it off. And then one wonders why it's taken 10 years or more. Because the critical years in the lead up to refurbishment at Grenfell Tower and all the rest, we have the tentacle reaching out and essentially corrupting the system. And the problem was there wasn't a way of dealing with this for those who felt, as many, and I would submit the majority of the population would want there to be not a risk-averse society as was held, not a cowardly society as it was described by those in the red tape challenge, but a courageous society that puts the priorities, even though they may cost in the initial stages money but save in the longer run. And in this context, therefore, with these principles in mind, there are just one or two documents that it's just worth reminding oneself of. Would you, I wonder, we have given notice, if I make sure I get the right reference, HOM 00018307, and it's the second page. Yes, here we are. Now, that's it. Thank you. I've called up this document because it's had some exposure. You will recall. This is the letter that Lord Pickles says is a fancy letter. Oh, it's a sort of letter, you know. CEOs send out from time to time to get their... I'm sorry, this is exactly the mentality of those who obviously don't regard safety as a top priority. But this letter, which it was dated, as the first page shows, was dated in April 2011 on the 8th. I'm not going to read it all. Can we go back to the second page? Sorry, we've got the date, April 2011. This marks the demarcation between the deregulatory policies before the coalition and then how the coalition, as it were, lifted all of that, as it were, work that had gone before and then honed it and focused it on safety, which they did. Now, I'm not going to repeat the Maidenhead speech, which in fact came a year later on the 2012, because the theme of targeting fire safety and safety generally as an albatross had been going on all around. So this is what ministers are getting. The last page of the letter, I don't ask for it to come up, indicates that this is a letter that went to all government ministers, went to the Cabinet Office and to the permanent secretaries of the civil service throughout. And there's no mealy-mouthed about this. There's no ambiguity about this. About new regulations, the top paragraph, I want us to be the first government in modern history to leave office having reduced the overall burden of regulation rather than increasing it. Next paragraph, bold ambition. If we try a new approach, and then he's talking about scrapping this, that, and so forth. I don't read all of it. In the past, when governments tried to deregulate, ministers were asked to make the case for abolition. In other words, the assumption was that regulations should stay unless there was a good case for getting rid of them. We're changing that presumption. We are changing the default setting. Our starting point is that a regulation should go, or its aim achieved in a different non-government way, unless there's a clear good justification for government being involved. And even when there is a good case for this, we must sweep away unnecessary bureaucracy, complexity and gold-plating of EU directives and challenge overzealous administration and enforcement. This marks a change from the old ways of doing things. You see quite clearly, I don't trouble you with the terms of the rest of it, it's all in the same vein. This isn't a fancy letter just to get the troops a bit worked up. This is the Prime Minister making very clear that his government is going to do things quite differently, even to the pre-regulatory regime that went before. That is why this letter is extremely important, and it's this letter combined with what the Prime Minister was saying in the Maidenhead speech and elsewhere about fire safety, that meant you had a combination, an aggressive approach to this policy. Safety is no longer given respect. It's kicked down the road because it's seen as the albatross or the hindrance. And this explains clearly, because this is 2011, the speech in Maidenhead 2012, the coroner's letter 2013. So the coroner's letter is coming into central government, Lord Pickles in particular, but others, at a time when actually nobody's taking it seriously, any more than the letter, carefully crafted, was taken seriously. You will remember, astonishing, the head of civil service within the department, Dame Melanie. I'm calling, if I may, her Lacanau moment. How could she be in this department, head of the civil service? She did not know about Lacanau. She did not know about the Rule 43 letter until the morning of the fire, when the Red Tape Challenge were meeting just down the road. She didn't know anything about it, but she wasn't alone. She hadn't been briefed. Why? Because it wasn't of concern. You saw some of the, or you saw the results of the slideshows that some ministers were given. The briefings were usually very brief, very informal, and not adequate at all, which is why Lacanau was on the back burner. But the slideshows themselves didn't deal with external fire spread, didn't deal with ADB, because they weren't tight, despite the building regulations. 70% are really concerned with safety, and yet it was relegated. It was relegated because of this kind of agenda. And it's serious because if you, there's another document I'd like to also refer you to, and that is the, sorry, just one moment to get the reference to it. I don't seem to have it readily available, but you will remember it's the Amos statement that he made to the House of Commons. I read it out in opening this module, and you will recall how serious that was for him. And we put it in our main submissions, but it is something that needs to be reflected on, because he now, the late Sir David, and in a way he summarises the attitude of anybody who tried to challenge. That's why the system is at stake here. And this is what Sir David was trying to say. This was a speech in 2019. The world was horrified when we saw a tower block ablaze in the 4th or 5th wealthiest country in the world. And it should never, never have happened. Over the past 6 years, the all-party group has met resistance when seeking improvements to fire safety, despite compelling evidence that such measures should be introduced. In the 13 years since the regulations were last reviewed, nothing has happened. It is perhaps rather easier for a Conservative member to make those points than for other members, because we should never have got to the position of the Grenfell Tower fire tragedy, especially after the warnings and the recommendations from the coroner after the Lacanau House fire and the 2013 inquest, the Rule 43 letter to the Secretary of State, the large number of letters exchanged between me and numerous ministers, 21 I think altogether, and meetings with successive ministers. It brings no comfort to the victims of Grenfell. It is the fault of the Conservative government, the Labour government, of every member of Parliament, that our voice was not heard and the recommendations were not listened to. Now, in a sense, that is a tribute to a man who fought hard, who was really rebuffed, who was seen as an irritant. They didn't encourage anybody to go and meet him. What's the problem with this? Problem is twofold. The system is not allowing this to penetrate the cabal-led cabinet, not allowing a position in which, and this was the APBG, 10 or 11 members as it was then, with Ronnie King, you will recall. Ronnie King, of great experience, lending his services to the committee. This is how Ronnie King was dismissed by Brian Martin, which led to the cross-examination by Mr. Millett. Basically, Brian Martin, wasn't going to allow anybody who knew what they were talking about to get anywhere near ADB to be allowed to make a constructive contribution. Why not? Oh, because, and this goes back to what's being said in the House of Lords recently, because, we'll go bankrupt. We'll starve to death. It's this approach that it's where you have safety in mind, it's getting in the way of what? Profit. Getting in the way of these it's such obvious equations that are being used that are remiss. And I want to pause, if I may, just on this, because we have...
Well, Mr. Mansfield, I hope you'll forgive me just for reminding you that we were going to break for lunch about now.
I misread. I thought I was going to go to... I'm quite happy to do that.
You sure?
Yes.
Well, when I say break for lunch, I mean you've run out of your time.
Well, I think I started at 5 past, but I can if you can give me an extra 5 minutes, I can do it now.
Well, should we say 10 to 1? Would that be all right?
Yes. Sorry, I thought
I'd... Thank you.
The point, there are a number of other points within this in terms of recommendations. Could I just pause to make the recommendation here, besides the system of government? Perhaps it's time to suggest that APPGs are given a statutory basis. There are a number of them, because they're within their basis and to be given powers. Because at the moment they're informal, they don't have statutory powers, and on the whole, if government wants to ignore them, that is precisely what they do. So I would ask for that to be considered as a possible recommendation for the future. The two other points I want to make. One is that an example of how the Rule 43 letter was ignored, and an example of why things are still the same. May I just, it's not a regulation, it's a different point, but it is within the ambit of what's been talked about today. You will recall Hanan Mojave gave evidence in Module 4, right here. And she describes what it's been like walking away from the fire. Her family were divided in the sense that half her family survived because her half, they got out. The other half didn't, because they were on a higher floor and they stay put. Stay put. Question being asked by the families this week. BBC asked the question right this week. If I live in a high-rise block, what am I supposed to do? Do we know? No, we don't. Looking at the government website on this issue, we're nowhere near getting answers. London Fire Brigade, yes. Government, no. Government has 4 stages. It's barely finished stage 1, which is only looking at the past evidence. Another 3 stages to go. Are we going to wait for people to die again? It's the same lethargy. There needs to be an urgency about these issues that we've been over. And we would impress you to, as it were, persist in the way that you have to date. Now, the final point in the last 2 minutes is this. We put it in the opening, and on behalf of Team 2, I request consideration by the panel again. The key figure in the 2010 coalition, the key figure, the architect of the policy that targeted safety, was David Cameron. And this is Hamlet without the prince. Why is he not being called? We have requested, it has been said twice, in reply, that it would be disproportionate. It would be unnecessary. Or may I say, we're not asking for every Prime Minister who's been, as it were, overseeing deregulation, just the one that turned, as it were, the focus towards fire safety. There are obviously necessary questions that the public and the families deserve an answer to. And that is, when he did say these things that he did, both in the letter and the Maidenhead speech and elsewhere, did he recognise what he was doing, creating the hostile environment in which these errors, these gaps, these mistakes, worse, occurred? Because he'd created the conditions of causation. And we say, once again, it needs answers from him rather than assumptions. And although we appreciate the pressure of time, we would be obliged for further consideration of that matter. And I'm sorry I misjudged the time.
That's all right. That's quite right. All right. Well, we'll thank you very much for your statement, your remarks. We'll break there. We'll resume, please, at 1:45, and we shall be back on track then. So thank you very much. 1:45, please.